This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Corenna Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Joining us by phone today is Dale Doughty, Commissioner of the Maine Department of Transportation. Commissioner, welcome to the program.
Hello, how are you this afternoon?
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
By the way, my co-host and husband, David Quirk, is unable to join us, so I'm flying solo, but we do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is the funding challenge that MaineDOT is facing right now?
Sure. So every year we build a brand new work plan. The work plan extends for 3 years, and then the next year we build over it. And the reason is that MaineDOT, transportation is a long-term effort, planning effort, design effort, construction effort. Bridges can take upwards of a couple years to design and several years to build. Paving projects might be a year to design and a year to build. Some are much quicker than that, but they're all different. But MaineDOT, for its capital program, the portion that we are maintaining, our 8,800 miles of highway, 2,800 bridges, is something called Highway Fund Capital, the state portion of that. And the state portion of the capital funding for a very long time has had a shortfall. The dedicated highway fund comes from motor fuel tax, registrations, some liquor revenue, and some auto-related sales tax go into a fund to maintain and build our highways. It's also utilized by the Maine State Police to patrol highways, Secretary of State to do licenses and registrations. And then MaineDOT uses a large portion of it to do all of our operations. We operate our highways, we plow snow, and do a lot of those things. What's left is a capital. And there's always a shortfall with that capital. We call it a structural gap. We have about a third annually of the amount of money we need to match federal funds and to maintain our highways and bridges statewide. Each year, something always comes up a year or two in advance to fill that gap. Sometimes it's general fund bonding. Sometimes it's general fund transfers when there's a surplus. Other times there's other mechanisms like something called TransCap. This year, the third year of our work plan this year, that gap has not been filled.
How large is the shortfall?
The structural gap is typically $170 million. The recent work plan that we built, we reduced that to 130, knowing that would be a challenge.
So how did we get here?
Again, this happens every year. We went through this session thinking that we would be able to come up with some solution to fill that gap. There were several proposals that came about. Unfortunately, late in the session, a bond was proposed, and that bond, with a bunch of other bonds, failed. One of the things that's causing this urgency now, instead of later in the work plan, are other things that are threats as well. There's the federal government on the federal side, so we match federal funds. On the federal side, every 5 years they do a reauthorization where they set the programs for Federal Highway, Federal Transit Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, those. That runs out September 30th of this year. They also do an annual appropriations bill that actually gives the federal government the ability to spend that money in the reauthorization bill. Last year, there was the longest federal shutdown in U.S. history. Our concern this year is that Congress doesn't get to a place where they're able to come to an agreement and fund those. So in addition to the state shortfall, there's also a potential for a federal issue. On top of that, I think everyone knows that fuel prices are up currently across the country, and fuel prices affect things like asphalt prices directly. They also affect other commodities like steel and concrete. So there's all of these things ahead of us. And why that matters and why now, for all of those reasons and some others, is that when we sign a contract for a paving project, that contract draws money for more than a year. It takes the contractor a while to construct the project, build it, buy the materials. So he's sending in bills for 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 months. If we sign a contract for a bridge project, that might be 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Once we sign those contracts, we have very little ability to change the rate of expenditure. So you can imagine owning a house, having a mortgage. You don't have the money. You're assuming that your salary will pay that mortgage and you'll have cash flow to be able to pay that. You also might have a car or a truck. Your wife or your husband have a vehicle. Maybe one of your kids has a vehicle. Maybe you have a home equity. And if you think of all those are all drawing cash from your cash flow monthly. Well, DOT is very much the same, and it's using federal and state money to be able to pay all those contracts. In your house, you probably have 3 or 4 or 5 of those. Can you imagine having hundreds of them that are over 3 or 4 or 5 years? Some are 1 year, but they're all drawing money at the same time. Once you sign those contracts, you lose control, or the control of the rate of that expenditure happens. So knowing that we have this shortfall in fiscal year 2028 starts July 1st, so that's 13 months from now, July 1st of next year. The issues with the federal government maybe this fall, all of those things coming up, we need to be able to manage those cost expenditures, because once they're out the door, we really have less control over them. So we're trying just to tone our program down slightly to be able to manage those expenditures into the future.
When you say tone it down, what does that mean?
That means that we're going to choose it. We've done one session, we're going to do 3. So the first one is that we've delayed 5 paving projects worth $67 million. We did that a couple months ago. In June, we're going to cut and delay. So we call it cut, but it's really putting those projects on the shelf and not advertising them. Those projects would advertise over the fall and winter, so they'd be for the next construction season. We would remove those, cut those, and set those on the shelf to be picked up later if these funding issues are resolved. So it's really cutting projects. The $130 million that I said, the state structural gap, relates to something like $400 million total, because if it's a federal project, for every $1 of state funding, it's $4 of federal funding. That federal funding isn't lost. We maintain it. It would be several years before we lost any. So that's why, and then state projects are $1 is $1. But depending on the mix, that's why we believe that to be about $400 million in cuts, and just setting those aside. That's about 20% of our program. So we still have the rest of the program we'll be moving forward with and managing those expenses.
So during the most recent legislative session, were transportation funding proposals introduced that could have helped address this structural gap and address some of these challenges?
There were 2 that were discussed. One was a bill to change the auto-related sales tax percentage. That was one. That one did that. Plus, it did a multitude of other things. It moved some of the state police from the highway fund to the general fund. So those were a couple of provisions. That failed to garner support. And then also, there was a bond bill that was also introduced that also failed to garner support. It was mixed with several others like agriculture and forestry, and a group of bonds packages that were advanced but did not garner adequate support.
Do you know what the total amount was that was requested?
I think originally we were asked for a proposal, so we wrote a bond package of $100 million. We provided it. What came out the other end, because it was a mix of other bond packages from that group of legislators, it came out at $65 million was considered, which would have given us an amount of time to be able to manage this decline. We would have been able to go further. Again, remember I said we're really managing against those future expenditures. That would have given us some time to be able to look for other solutions, but neither of those were able to advance forward.
It's interesting when you mention bond. It seems like every election cycle or every other that we seem to be voting on transportation bonds for roads and bridges, and we always approve them. How are those prepared? Do you submit those? Tell me about the bond process.
Sure. There's a lot of different ways that occurs. I think we make this structural gap known, and typically a legislator, a group of legislators, sometimes the administration forwards a proposal like happened this session. We support those and we'll testify in support of those. So they usually come from a group of legislators that support them. And this has gone on for a very long time. So people are aware. We had spoken about this gap to the Transportation Committee and others as this process moved on. I think really what's different this time, or what feels different to me, is just legislative priorities. We have a very large, physically large state with a small population, and we're managing a lot of infrastructure, but we're also managing a lot of other issues in the state. Quite honestly, I just think there were a lot of issues this session that lawmakers had to address, regardless of party. I think this is really a legislative priority issue more than anything else. It's not anyone's issue or fault, but I just think there's just so much going on and so many needs across the state that this just didn't get that traction. I think one of the things that we haven't done recently, and something we're working on right now, because there were times when there were general fund surpluses, and because we use that other mechanism I said for TransCap, which we've maxed out, general fund bonds haven't been something that this legislature or society in general have had to deal with in the last few years. So we kind of lost that. And I think it's onerous. It's on us really to help people understand what transportation is all about, why transportation affects everything we do, really painting that picture with municipalities, with legislators, with all kinds of interest groups to really help people understand why transportation is so fundamental. So that next session or as soon as we can have this discussion again, and it becomes a priority because it is so essential to all of us.
What types of projects would be most vulnerable to these delays or these reductions?
That's an interesting question because there's a couple pieces to it. One, the way we're approaching these cuts, putting these projects on the shelf, one of the biggest things that we use our funding for, it's not expansion of the system. There's some of that. It's not a lot of new infrastructure. Just because the state has so much infrastructure and so much to maintain, most of our core money, we have special federal funding, things like that. We can do transformative things. But some of it, just asset management. It's like having a house and putting a new roof on your house, new paint on the shutters. It's paving, it's managing our bridges, which are in a bit of a decline, and we can talk about that if you wish. So a lot of what we do is what we call asset management. It's just managing the assets, just like at your home or your car. So what's vulnerable? What we would be looking for is we send it back. We have technical committees that look at how we manage those all over the state. They're looking into what can we delay, what could we postpone for a period that would have the least impact on the infrastructure. So if you have this 2,800 bridges across the state, and we all had work on them, we need to do, how do we pick some projects that have the least impact if those projects were delayed a year or two? The same thing with paving, the same thing with intersection projects and mobility projects, and the same thing with multimodal projects, transit type of things, other things like that we can postpone today that have the least impact on society, have the least impact on people's economy and quality of life. So the ones we've already cut, I said there were 5 paving projects. We looked at paving projects that if we were to delay and this problem was fixed, we could redo next year. And those 5 projects for $67 million, those are ones that would have the least impact, or we would change the treatment type a little bit if we let it go a year. We're looking for bridges that maybe we're doing refurbishment. That could wait another year to that refurbishment or that replacement. So it's those types of projects.
Since you brought it up, I've always wondered, how do you pick the roads? Because there's particular roads that I've been driving on and I'm thinking, this road would actually be better if it was dirt at this point.
Yeah.
So how do you pick those out and how do they get pushed off if they're so bad that, in my mind, it could cause an accident?
There are a couple different categories of pavement or managing the pavement. There are things that we call pavement preservation, and those are roads that have been built to modern standards. So it has a strong base, the geometry of the road is good, the pavement structure is good, but those last between 12 and 18 years, and we cycle around and pave those. And we're really trying to maintain what we have. We're not letting it degrade to the point where we have to fully reconstruct the road for millions and millions a mile. We're spending hundreds of thousands or $1 million a mile to really maintain what we have. So that's one category. Then there's another category of lower class roads where we do pavement and it's essentially for serviceability. And probably the roads that you're describing are the second part. So we would pave a preservation road maybe a little sooner before it has that feel of being very rough or coming apart or the potholes are numerous because we're preserving something that's already there. It's cheaper to preserve it once you put all that money into it. Compared to a road that's really never been built to modern standards, it's a lower class road, has less traffic. Those roads are really on a cycle, and a lot of those are on a 7-year. It's called light capital paving. And those just come on a 7-year cycle. There's no strong asset management type of this is happening to the road. It's the right time now. So if you looked at one, you'd wonder, geez, this is potholey as heck, but they're over there paving that one, and it's not so bad. Those are 2 different objectives. One is to keep that road good at a lower cost than it would be to let it go and rebuild it, because it's a high-class road, lots of traffic compared to a lower-class road with less traffic.
That's interesting. So at what point do you say, okay, we're tired of repaving this road because it's a lesser quality? When do you go to bringing it to a higher quality so that you're just maintaining it at that point?
That really relates to the use of the road and the function of the road.
Okay.
So our roads are in highway classifications. We have them classified from a highway classification 1 all the way down to a 4, and then local roads are a 5. So highway class 1 and 2, those are intended to be constructed and built. They carry most of the traffic. They tend to be high speed. And then you get to the local roads that are 3s and 4s. Some of the threes we're rebuilding on a cycle. We don't build them to the same standards, but we build them to a lesser standard, but we're building those on a cycle. The fours, really right now, as much of this mileage we have in the state and how broad it is, those fours are probably going to be just on this 7-year cycle for a very, very long time, just because the state doesn't have the money to reconstruct those at this time. And they're really almost a local road. They're not a local road, but they're very, very close to a local road, and they really serve local traffic. Those are typically called collectors. The higher class ones are called arterials. The arterials are the backbone, and it's just like a tree or just like your circulation system. You have this trunk of the tree, that's a HBC 1, and then you have the big branches, that's a 2, the smaller branches, the leaves themselves, the tips of the leaves are a 5, that's a local road. It's really the trunk and the bigger branches are the ones that we reconstruct now, and we're trying to work our way through those smaller branches, but it's going to take a long time to work our way through those. And these hiccups in funding are exactly what puts us back on maintaining and trying to make that structural improvement throughout the state.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, and my guest today is Dale Doughty, Commissioner of the Maine Department of Transportation. So what options are on the table right now to address this gap?
There's a couple things. We'll get to the options, but I think the first thing is really getting back to what we talked about earlier, is really educating the public on what the transportation system does very quickly, and legislators, and what happens, what the structural gap means to be able to maintain the state's transportation system, what it means to the economy, what it means to people's lives, and what it means to safety. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we're really getting around trying to talk to all user groups, everything from the contracting community to the municipal community, like PED community. We're talking to legislators. It's been a long day today, and that's because we've been trying to run around and educate people about a couple things. One, the need, but then some of the options. And the options that we can certainly talk about is this idea of bonding, at least for the next 2 years. There's a couple things we really should stay focused on. One is this isn't a one-year problem, because we're going to build our next work plan starting this fall. And then we're going to have exactly the same problem in fiscal year 29, so 24 plus 1 month from now. And then after that, it's just going to keep going. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. One is, how do we fill this gap for the next 2 years so we can get our program back on? We don't lose ground on asset management. We don't have contractors that are struggling to keep their employees and equipment up to date, because that'll just cost us all more. So really focus on things like a bond or other mechanisms that the legislature or the governor can come up with to maybe fill that gap for 2 years. But at the same time, really start this longer term conversation about how we fund transportation in the future. There's, as you might guess, and I think most people know, cars are much more fuel efficient than when I was younger. And gas tax is based on volume, not on the price. So more fuel efficient cars, people finding ways to telecommute and do things and reduce the mileage, but we all need the system still. Gas tax might not be probably the best mechanism into the future. So other mechanisms, we talked earlier about, there's auto sales and auto related sales. A portion of that comes to the highway fund. I think it's 40% at this moment. Some money comes from the state's sale of liquor that goes into the highway fund. So those are mechanisms that were not the traditional registration and gas tax revenue. I think we need to come up with more, and I don't think there's a single fix. If you were to try to fix this with just simply increasing the gas tax today, it would take, to get to that 170 million would be around 25 cents on top of the already 30-cent state motor fuel tax. That's not practical or palatable to most people. So what other kinds of funding resources can we bring into the long term? And I think we need to do those simultaneously, because this is just going to keep occurring. We're going to stop and start. Our infrastructure is going to be damaged. Our contracting community is going to be damaged, and our economy is going to be damaged if we don't fix this in the long term.
Why do you think transportation funding seems to be so complicated?
I think it's a variety of things. I think part of it is just trying to cobble together enough money. It's such a small state. There's 1.4 million of us, and there's 24,000 miles of public road in the state. 8,800 are taken care of by DOT. Those are the ones with the high traffic that are connecting towns and communities and people. That's just a lot of infrastructure, 2,800 bridges, and then sidewalks and lots of other things that are the components to our transportation system, transit, things like that. For 1.4 million people to manage that and manage matching federal funds and those, that's just a complicated, difficult thing. And the environment's changing. We said motor fuel tax has been around since early in the 19th century, and it's what's funded both federally and locally here in Maine, our transportation system. Well, things are changing. Vehicles are getting more efficient. Electric vehicles are coming online. There's just many, many things like that that are making it more complicated. And there are just so many other priorities in the state, social and economic priorities, that it's difficult to carve out enough money to continue unless we really take a deep dive and figure out something going forward.
Are there any states that you're researching to see if they have a good platform to follow maybe?
There are. I think there's a couple things. We'll talk about that and then we'll circle back around. There are states that are doing things called MBUF, which is mileage-based user fee. So instead of charging people based on the amount of fuel they put in their car, or at least fossil fuel, they actually charge people for the mileage that they use the car. When you do that, you can divide that up. Gas tax right now, my 3/4-ton pickup uses a lot more fuel than my Honda commuting car. So those are already indexed for that kind of vehicle. You can do the same thing on mileage-based user fee. What kind of vehicle it is, what the weight of the vehicle is, what the vehicle is used for. States are looking at that. Vermont is a nearby state that's looking at those sorts of things. There's a bunch of other states, Virginia and a bunch of Midwest states. But again, those tend to be filling gaps. They come online with other types of solutions. There are other states that are using things like high efficiency vehicles. So any vehicle that gets better than 20 miles to the gallon gets a surcharge when they register the vehicle. So there's a lot of those things. Then others, like we are doing with the auto-related sales tax, are finding other revenue sources to infuse into the system. None have got it completely figured out. States that are more populous with lesser miles maybe are getting farther on than other states, but everybody's struggling with it, including the federal government. So the federal government has the Highway Trust Fund, which is a fund that does something very similar. And that trust fund keeps getting at the precipice of bankruptcy every once in a while. And there's probably one that's just over the horizon in 24 or 36 months. I can't remember the time frame, but it's only within a year or two. And if there were a gas tax holiday or something like that, that would bring it closer. So not only are the states wrestling with it, and lots of people have lots of different ideas, and we certainly talk with most of those, but I don't think anybody's completely figured out. And usually it's not one pill, it's a combination of types of things that the states use to try to fill this gap.
Well, in Maine, it takes an hour to get anywhere, so I'm not sure mileage would work.
I'm not either. Yeah, might be a piece of it, but not all of it. And the challenge with mileage-based user fees, if you do it state by state, we have many, many visitors in the summer. How does that work for them? If we're all registering our vehicle and paying a surcharge or paying a monthly charge or whatever, each state does it a little different. What about people that come into the state? How do you assess them their fair share? We don't want Mainers to carry the entire burden when lots of people are enjoying our transportation system as part of their vacation or part of their business. We want to make sure this is fair and equitable. So that's one of the issues of taking some of those type of things on state by state instead of region by region or even the country.
So roughly what percentage comes from federal funding versus state funding?
Hey, that's a great question. If you look at our work plan, if you went online and you looked at the work plan, there's an introduction. And as you open the introduction, there's a couple of pie charts. One is the source of funds. Later on, there's the use of funds. So where the funds come from. So it's a pie chart. And when you look at that, all the blue portion of that pie chart are federal funds. And the green slivers, there are multiple slivers, are state funding. If you look at those, both are about 40%. So it's about 40% federal and 40% state. And that's not all highway. That's transit, FTA, FRA. That's the big picture. But if you drill into the highway and bridge funding piece of it, if you drill into those, what you find is that there are kind of two types of projects. There are projects that are short-term, might not be federally eligible, or might just be for a variety of reasons built with state funds. And there's a small portion of those. We talked earlier about the classification of roadways, HPC system, the Highway Corridor Priority System 4s are paved on a cycle. Because that's a short cycle, we tend to do that with state money. That's not as eligible for federal money. It can be in some cases, but we build those with state. So every dollar that's needed is a state dollar. Those are fairly small programs. Then the federal money is broken into two categories, sort of. There's something, and there are lots of slivers, lots of fund sources that you can only spend for certain things. But one of the bigger buckets that have a number of those slivers is something called formula funds. And those are apportioned to each state under a formula that's run through USDOT. So one of the categories inside this bucket of formula funds is STVBG, by example. STVBG is a great example. There are a number of federal fund sources under Federal Highway Administration, but that's a flexible one. This can be used on pretty much any of those highway corridor priorities. Remember I said there were priorities 1 through 4 were us and 5 were locals. So any one of the highway corridor priority 1s, 2s, and most of the 3s to reconstruct things, to preserve pavement, to do any of those things. There's also bridge funding. But the way that works is that's a state-run, federally assisted program. We sign a contractor starts paving a project. They send us monthly bills. We typically repay those bills in either 15 or 30 days. We pay them very quickly, but we're paying those with state funding. That state funding goes into something called suspense. And what happens is once the federal funds become available in their system, we'll draw those federal funds down, pay for that project, and then recoup the state funds. We'll go build another project with those state funds. And as soon as, and it could be immediately, those federal funds are available, we'll release those federal funds. Those are funds that are guaranteed to us. They come on a timing. We have to obligate them and do those sort of things. But you can see how there's a cycle of state funds. You need a pool of state funds to build those projects, then to take the federal funds to recover the state funds to build the next project. Each time you do that, you leave 20% behind because we're matching it with 20%. So another reason I go through that whole discussion is that this is very complex. We have a whole professional staff maintaining all these at any one moment. We need to have the cash to pay our contractors when bills are due. When I sign a contract, those bills come over a long period of time. So it's a very complex system of trying to understand when bills will be due for hundreds of projects, what we need for state money to pay for them, when we can recover the federal money, when we can reuse the state money and move on. So that's only a portion of the complexity about that. I also talked about TransCap a while ago. That TransCap was one of the solutions to fill the gap. TransCap is a state money source, but it's a bond. That bond can't be used for any of that cycling. It can only be used for the 20% that'll land in that project in the end. It can't be used for something that's going to be reimbursed. So that source is a great source. It's helped us get through, but it's also limited in our management of funds. I know that's a lot of detail, but I just want people to understand how complex this is, how much management it takes to build and run under a federal aid system.
So can you explain what TransCap is exactly?
I mentioned earlier that we've had this structural problem for many, many years. That structural problem has been filled, and I said it currently is annually to the tune of $170 million for state money. That structural gap over the years have been filled with a lot of different things. One, just general fund bonding that's supported by the general fund. It's also been infused through this governor and this legislature by using general fund transfers when there's been a surplus in the general fund. So there's been a bunch of those mechanisms. One of the last mechanism that was used, and that covered the last 2 years, so it would be state fiscal year 26 and 27, was something called TransCap. And TransCap was a revenue bond that came off the highway fund. So it's supported, it's paid back through the highway fund, through Maine Bond Bank. And what that is just a bond. But that bond has some restrictions on it.
How long does it take to retrieve your funds back from the federal government?
To retrieve funds from the federal government once we've built a project. Once the funds exist within their system, we can do that almost instantaneously. It's all electronic. We file a request. Very quickly, those funds come back to us. The trouble is, because we build on a cash flow model, sometimes we have funds that have been expended that we're waiting for the next tranche of federal funds to become available. So once they're available annually, and depending on things like the bills I talked about earlier, like the appropriations bill, if an appropriation bill is in place, usually we receive most of our federal funds for the year right there. But if we have a shutdown, those don't become available, they become available piecemeal. But we're always building projects. So as soon as the funds become available, we'll draw those down and repay. And the only reason I go through all this is just the complexity and the machinations it takes to run a federal aid system.
As we wrap up, what's the one thing you want Maine taxpayers to understand about the MaineDOT funding that they may not fully understand today?
I think there's just a couple things that are all related. One, it's complex. There are lots of sources. Those sources have restrictions. There are a lot of procedural sources. But I think the most important thing for us all to take away is how important transportation is to us societally. My predecessor used to say, transportation is the furnace in the basement. Many days you don't even remember it's there. It just works. You get up in the morning, your water for your shower is warm, your house is warm. You don't even think about it until that January morning you wake up and it's not working. And all of a sudden then it becomes your highest priority. Well, transportation is exactly that. Our system works every day. It serves our people every day. It serves our economy every day. It serves our visitors. But when it doesn't work and when we can't invest in it the way we should, it'll be just like the furnace in the basement on that January morning. When it's not working, everyone will notice because it's so integrated to our lives.
Dale Doughty, Commissioner of the Maine Department of Transportation, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.